So let's go ahead and skip to the Messenia essay and try to work through this as quickly as possible. So Messenia then, looking at this specific text that we talked about, right, this conversation between the accuser or the adversary, Satan, and Yahweh. So he orchestrates this plan to destroy Job's livestock, kill his sons, all these things, right? His point then here, or where is Redding coming from? Important to ask, right? He is a student at Wake Forest Divinity. He's also a minister. Right, so important now to think about the fact that he's coming as a minister, and he in fact is making this point at the beginning. This is a book that is perplexing and discomforting, right? Very few who are pastors enjoy preaching or teaching it because it doesn't give any sort of resolution, right? It doesn't answer the questions that we have. It doesn't answer ultimately that question of why do bad things happen to good people, right? So he says, you know, we read it and we see that pious Job suffers as a result of a capricious wager between God and the accuser. Job's heavenly bully seems fallacious compared to modern liberal religious idealisms, and my attempts to interpret this God from my progressive Christian perspective only obfuscates my understanding of God's actions. In other words, he still doesn't really understand what God's actions are in this book. It's not really clear, right? So he says, my life's been easy in America. No, I've never gone to war, no genocide, no major traumas. Interesting also considering the fact that now we're all going through this major trauma, right? I speak of suffering as I see it and experience it occurring around the world. Unimaginable evil happens daily, and Job's presentation of God makes this evil even more irreconcilable and horrifying, right? If we think about God actually doing this, taking everything away from someone, right? Even giving them boils, taking all their family away just to see if he'll still be faithful. That's scary. It's scary to think about if we read this literally, that God would actually do that, right? So again, no idyllic resolutions. He says children's sermons and often try to bring this common message that God is loving and would never willingly harm anyone. So being afraid of God is unfounded and misguided. Job's God shatters these useful romanticized notions, right? I mean, God is doing this to Job. If Job's presentation of God is true, then God is responsible for the world's suffering, and God is culpable for horrific events like the Holocaust or the genocides in Rwanda, right? So these banal phrases like, it's all part of God's plan, often arise in the aftermath of catastrophes. And even right now, right, that's some of what I've heard too in responses to COVID-19. The problem is that what befalls Job because of God's actions is trivial and purposeless. And God even admits that in 2:3. It was a perverted and pointless bet. There is no divine plan. So Job mourns. He cries out to God. For 30 chapters, God remains silent. God's retort is just as appalling as the initial bet because God reminds Job of his lowly humanity and states that God is the one who created and upholds the universe. So even when God does speak, what God says is not comforting. In summary, God asks Job, what place do you or any human have in questioning me? All humans, even the virtuous like Job, are to remain subservient as God's subjects. Is this actually what we believe? Is this actually what we believe of God, right? This gets back to that question of reading this literally and reading it figuratively, right? If we read it literally, this is literally what God is saying. You have no right, to question me. How dare you? But in the end, right, God. Okay, so what Redding is trying to get us to do is grapple with who God is, how God is represented, I should say, within the text of Job, right? So picking up where we just left off, Job cries out to God. God remains silent for 30 chapters, and then essentially what Redding is arguing, and right, this is his exact statement, God's speech is akin to a schoolyard bully spitting and rubbing dirt on the child he or she has just beaten. Job's apparent acceptance of his place as a mere pawn within God's cosmos is disheartening because God makes Job's life dispensable, which in turn questions the value of human existence. In the end, God then restores and doubles, right, what Job had previously had, which Job enjoys with reverence and humility until his natural death, right? So what we're having to think about then is, once again, the representation of God in Job, right? And the difference between our understanding of God in reality versus the representation of an author who is trying to figure out how God operates, specifically around this question of, right, why do bad things happen to good people, as we were discussing before. So to go on then with Redding's argument, he says, to speak frankly, God is unjust in Job. The deity authorizes the accuser, the adversary, the Hasatan, to make sport of torturing and killing innocent people. God remains silent as Job mourns his unjustified circumstances. And God's response then is pompous, arrogant, and downright frightening. So what we have to do then, as we're thinking about, or thinking with Redding, right, is to consider critically the way God is represented and how we might actually be uncomfortable with this idea of God. And it might then be in conflict with our notions of God as loving or generous or gracious, right? Again, but the author is trying to work through this. He goes on and says, God's act of replacing dead children, 10 of them no less, severely diminishes the importance of human life. God seems to equate life with something that could be acquired from the local department store, Redding writes. So here are his reflections that he sort of boils down into a simple question. What place does the book of Job have in contemporary life? Should people console mourning loved ones and friends by reading Job, or should the entire book be in an editor's trash can? He says it raises more questions than it answers, and this actually might be intentional. Perhaps the author compiled this story as a personal therapeutic act as he or she attempted to reconcile recent catastrophes. Maybe the writer wanted to challenge traditional notions of divine omniscience and justice by writing something so outlandish that readers had no choice but to reconsider their assumptions and conclusions regarding God, suffering, and evil, which then sort of brings us back to what Job's wife said. Possibly, right, this is about Job releasing previous notions, theological notions, ideas of God that he has, because he's grappling with the reality of life and suffering and its impermanence. So ultimately, right, Redding is saying this text, like so many that we read, doesn't give us any answers, right? It just leaves us with more questions. And maybe that's the purpose, right? Is just asking questions, because in asking those questions, as we discussed, right, we're open and we're curious and we're asking. We haven't come to some sort of resolution that keeps us thinking that we have all the answers. So in conclusion, he writes, what we can assert is that this book's presentation of God contributes to the Bible's theological cacophony. A cacophony then is a bunch of disparate voices all at once. The Bible's disharmony is an intrinsic and inflexible product of human effort, right? Humans writing this text, which gives readers the right to question, the right to dispute, to speculate, and even to deny its claims. The book of Job shows one individual's multiple view of God and the world. Thus, the book must be placed within a broader understanding of Scripture that encompasses humanity's limited understanding of the past and its idealized perception of the present. Also, right, our limited understanding about what God actually is doing, and any attempts to sort of try to wrap our minds around that. Making Job's theology doctrinal, elevating it to status as truth, degrades the value of lived experience and discredits a simple hope that inspires humanity into daily living, right? Living the questions. If we take nothing else away from the book, we can find solidarity with long-deceased humans as they struggle and live amidst chaotic evil. I think that is a great place to stop, because it definitely connects to what we're experiencing right now, right? We're all in this boat together, suffering and trying to figure it out.